Good afternoon, everybody. So it's very interesting today, the announcement on tax cuts made by the new Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, in Liz Truss's government. That's the first thing they've announced this week in terms of domestic policy, apart from sending more money to Ukraine, which is absolutely ridiculous. But, you know, this announcement today of a tax-cutting budget, I think is partly good and partly bad. Now, I'm all for lower taxes. Lowering taxes is the thing to do because people should not pay more tax than absolutely necessary to pay for the vital public services that the government runs. And at the UK, we've sort of decided that the government is going to run education, it's going to run healthcare, it pays for roads, it pays for rail subsidies, it pays subsidies for energy, including the nonsensical wind and solar. It pays for the military, of course, it pays for prisons and the police service and those kind of things. So that's what governments have sort of decided, and a lot of things on the top. I think that this is actually quite good. To be honest, I'm gonna give credit where credit is due. To not raise corporation tax from 19p, keep it at 19p rather than go up to 26p in the pound. That's good for businesses. It means that businesses are going to benefit from that, and it will stop some of them from going bankrupt, which they would have done if they'd increased the corporation tax rate. They're going to reduce income tax by 1 penny to 19p to bring it in line with corporation tax. They're not going to put up national insurance by 1.25% like Rishi Sunak was going to do. They've increased the limit, the starting point for paying stamp duty, which is good. Stamp duty on houses, that's good because of course there's massive house price inflation, so you know it's almost impossible to get a foot on the housing ladder these days, but that's going to help people who are, you know, buying first time homes, and also, you know, buying and selling homes under 250,000. So that's all good. The problem is that means they're going to get less revenue from taxation. So the only way to make that up is either to borrow more or to cut spending. And if you're going to reduce taxes, what I think you should do, the only way you should fund that is by cutting spending. You shouldn't fund it by increasing borrowing, because if you increase borrowing, then that feeds into inflation, and the inflation will just eat up all of the good work you've done by reducing taxes. And there are so many things that this government spends money on, and governments over the last 25 years in the UK have wasted hundreds and hundreds of £billions on, which they shouldn't have done. So there's foreign aid, there's migrant hotels, there's diversity officers, there's HS2, there's subsidies for wind power, there's subsidies for solar power, which is basically money down the drain, while they have demolished coal power stations and they haven't built nuclear power stations, which is what they should be doing. There's all these reorganisations in the National Health Service, and essentially that's a complete mess because there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians, to use a phrase. I don't mean literal Indians, that's the phrase. You know, I actually believe that the NHS should be trying to employ British young people, and we should be training enough British nurses and doctors to fill up the available positions in the NHS, rather than going abroad to try to bring doctors and nurses from other countries that have been trained there. But it's all an absolute mess. NHS funding and NHS procurement. You know, NHS trusts and so on, and hospitals have got these contracts with these, what do they call them? Private equity plans or something, you know, that Tony Blair started off. And, you know, under these sort of plans, they have to go to specific service providers to get a window fixed or to change a light bulb. So instead of someone saying, you see there's a light bulb that is broken, well, what I would do is I'd just go to Tesco's or Sainsbury's or whatever, buy a light bulb for 50p, come back and change it myself. But they're not allowed to do that. They have to pay the service provider's electrician. They come out and they fix your light bulb and they charge you 300 or 400 quid, which is an absolute disastrous waste of money. And this happens all over the public sector, in the NHS, in schools, in police stations, all over the place. They've got these mad arrangements with public-private partnerships, which fleece the taxpayer and waste, billions of pounds a year on these stupid contracts, where people could just do stuff themselves. But, in the 60s and the 50s and the 19th century, if something was wrong, you'd fix it yourself. You wouldn't rely on a service provider that charges you 50 times what it would cost you to do it yourself. Anyway, that's just one silly thing that it's just absolutely barking mad, that we waste money on by the billions in this country. There's other things as well. There's all the quangos that the government has. There's the BBC, and they fund NGOs, which they shouldn't do. NGOs which are political in nature, and then, NGOs like Stonewall. So the government gives Stonewall money, and then they pressure the government to change their policy and introduce laws which fit them, and then they take these sexualizing materials to relationships, education, and so on. These things which parents are very, very concerned about all over the country. So these are things that we waste billions and billions of pounds on, which we should just cut now, immediately. Just cut it off, and that would save billions and tens of billions of pounds. And then we could afford to cut taxes, because we would then have fiscal responsibility. So, the government should not spend more than it gets in taxation. Otherwise, you increase the national debt and you get inflation. But what the government's done is they've reduced reduced the income from tax. That's great. But then they're increasing the borrowing, which means you're getting more out of line than we were before. We were already out of line because of the craziness of the fiscal irresponsibility of lockdowns and net zero, and now they're getting more out of line than ever before, when what we actually need to do is come back into line, not by increasing taxes, but by reducing spending. But they're not doing that, and the reports are saying we are now heading for a budget deficit this year of 190 billion, and that's going to become the norm, on top of 500 billion down the drain on lockdown, which we've borrowed but we haven't got to spend, and that's just gone onto the national debt, and everybody is paying that back, and will be for centuries to come, probably. The figures are just getting astronomically stupid. In August, the interest for 1 month on our national debt in the UK was 8 billion. 8 billion just in interest. That's not even paying down the national debt itself. That's the money we have to pay to the Bank of England and others that have created money out of thin air, which they can do by some system. Nobody knows how they do that and why they're allowed to do that, but they can do that, and other places. And then we borrow that money from them, and then we pay them back masses of interest. But this is just leading towards a catastrophic fiscal collapse. So, I'm all for cutting taxes. I applaud cutting taxes, but I absolutely abhor the increase in spending that the Truss regime is embarking on. So while, some people are celebrating and just looking at one side of the coin, we've got to look at the other side of the coin as well. And we've got to realise that tax cuts with massive spending increases and borrowing increases are not going to do us any good in the medium or long term. This is just a fig leaf over something which is a very, very big injury to the country's economy, the nation's economy, and it's going to get worse. We need to get back to financial responsibility and live within our means. Cut taxes, cut spending as well, and don't increase our national debt so that our pound ends up being worth absolutely nothing at all.